So let's get into this conversation now. There's just for about 4 days to go until the start of the 17th edition of the Paralympic Games. The global sporting spectacle will take place in Paris and will run from the 28th of August until the 8th of September. So Paralympians from all over the world are putting in their final touches to their preparations. And to get more insight on the Paralympic Games today, we get to speak to one of South Africa's most celebrated Paralympians. Natalie du Toit is a 13-time Paralympian gold medalist, and of course many would remember her as the first amputee swimmer to be part of the Olympic Games back in Beijing in 2008. Natalie, good morning, and thank you so much for your time this morning on the Weekend Report. There's just a lot of excitement, right, in the build-up to the Paralympic Games. I can imagine also the anticipation of the athletes in terms of them representing their respective countries at the Paralympic Games in France in just a couple of days' time. Them now having to take over the baton from the Olympians. Talk to us about, you know, what feelings these Paralympians might be going through in the build-up to the Paralympic Games.
Good morning, and thanks, Rachel, for having me on the show. Yeah, I think it's an amazing time. It is, you know, we've had this hype of the Olympic Games, and I'm sure that the Paralympic athletes have been watching, been watching what the swimming pool does or the athletics track does and how the athletes have been performing at the Olympic Games. It is now, I mean, as you mentioned, 4 days. So it is getting to that time where some are just getting into the village. Some have been there for a few days. Those that have been there for a few days have to make sure that all their washing is done. Those that are getting in still have that hype of, you know, getting into this new area that they're going to be staying in. Obviously, there was a lot of talk at the Olympics in terms of the rooms. But, you know, a lot of the time it's really exciting to get into your room, to unpack your suitcase and start preparing. You know, you get to the training facility or the competition facility. And every time you get into that water, you think, this is it. You know, we've trained all this time and it's now time for us to get in and do what it is we need to do. I know some of the swimmers are there from Team South Africa, and, you know, definitely on social media. So I've been watching that and looking forward to it. You know, we've got a very small group of, I know, swimmers particularly that are over there. But yes, you know, it is really excitement. It is waiting for that opening ceremony day. That day can be pretty tough because you have to wait for hours. Generally, you have to queue and wait for your country. It's all about getting dressed up and, you know, going to the opening ceremony and experiencing it. And then generally all those athletes that don't compete on the first day probably won't go to the opening ceremony, and they'll be resting and focusing for that first day. So I mean, I know from my experience, it was really excitement, it was nerves, it was absolutely everything in between.
I want to take you back to a point that you made earlier on when you spoke about the fact that Team South Africa doesn't have much swimmers at this year's Paralympic Games. What does that boil down to, Natalie? Are there not many swimmers coming up the ranks, Paralympian swimmers?
So, you know, I think it's been challenging over the years where, you know, in my group, there were a lot of Paralympians that actually retired all at once. And so it is about bringing other athletes through. I see that we have some S13s, some S12s, which is more the visually impaired classes and less of the physically disabled classes that are at the Paralympics. I wanted to touch on a little bit about qualification because it's not as simple as just getting to what we would call our national championships and getting up onto that starting block and diving in and swimming a qualifying time. In the para side of things, you actually have to attend world championships. And if you're top 2 in the world, you create a spot for your country. So if one person only creates or comes top 2, they only create one spot. So for example, if I won 7 races, I only create one spot for the country. So it is a lot more challenging in the para side of things. There are other opportunities to compete overseas and actually, you know, try and get a qualifying time and get top 2 in those events. But again, that's adding to funds, it's adding to a lot of traveling costs, traveling. And as a disabled athlete, that's not always easy. Another challenge that we have here in South Africa is international classification. So, you know, classifiers, which we will call people who have the credentials to qualify in terms of international Paralympic standard. they usually come out maybe once a year and they classify you. So we have our own South African classifiers. But if you're also not internationally classified, you can't compete internationally.
Yeah.
Sometimes they use international events also to get classified, and they pay all that money to travel just to be able to be classed. And that's also gone through quite a bit of a challenge over the last few years. So yes, there's a lot of interesting bits and parts to it, and it's not always about the development of swimmers coming through, but also the means and the opportunities out there.
Now, that's an interesting analysis. I wasn't aware that, it's quite broad, and you just explained it to us very perfectly, Natalie. But, you spoke about how it's a small team, Team South Africa, about 34 athletes heading to the Paralympic Games. Many of them will be making their debut as well. How should a debutante approach their first Paralympic Games, especially when there might be huge expectations on themselves, as well as expectations from the nation? How do they go about navigating their first Paralympic Games?
It is all about, I think, maintaining your composure. So it is taking in all the excitement, but also, trying to calm yourself down so that when the day of competition comes, you get up onto that starting block and you just say to yourself, I can't do any more. We're 4 days before as well. There's nothing more that the athlete can do. It's about getting up on that block and just believing that anything, that they can achieve anything. As it's a really interesting conversation, because we've heard a lot of the athletes who went to Tokyo as their first games, and they didn't have crowds, they didn't have the noise or anything like that. So a lot of them have struggled at the Olympic Games specifically this particular time, because they weren't used to that atmosphere. So this time, for those debutantes, they've got that. They've got the crowds that are going to cheer them on. I know the swimming pool itself is quite loud, and I believe it can be quite, it can sort of pull you in quite nicely. And I know for myself, always getting up on that starting block, you always feel like it doesn't matter who they're cheering for. You just believe that they're cheering you on when you get up onto that starting block. So, it's for them to take it all in. It is not easy, because the competition is really tough. And, a lot of the athletes are there. They are there to do a job. They're there to achieve. And some can be quite nasty. Some can be really friendly. And again, it's what you make of it. When you're in that call-up room, it's how you speak to the other athletes. It's how you manage yourself. And that will be very, very important for those debutantes at this Paralympic Games. And I think, South Africa's all behind them. They've worked hard, and we support them, and they're going out there, holding the South African flag high, and definitely, just to say to them, absolutely good luck.
Yeah, and that support from South Africa is going to be very vital. Of course, we saw the Olympian team being supported as well at the Paralympic Games. But the support, though, the support structure from those around the athletes, and Natalie, from the team doctors, the psychologists, the physiotherapists, those that have to work with their athletes on a daily basis to sort of ready themselves to compete. How vital is that support?
Oh, it's quite interesting, because I think athletes come from different backgrounds. And when it comes to disabled athletes, I find that they don't often, or we didn't often have a lot of what others had. So, for example, you might not be used to going for physiotherapy. You might not be used to seeing a hall full of food, which I think is for everybody worldwide, to have, food in the eating hall 24/7. There are so many different things. And I think what's really important is that the support is there for those that need it and when they need it. It's definitely there. I know, on tours, physios work their hands to the bone when they're on tours. And, from that perspective, I think it is amazing for there to be the doctor, be the support. Remember, a doctor is there as a doctor, but also there is drug testing. And with that, you have to have someone generally that comes with you in case anything goes wrong, or they can vouch for you as well. You also need them to sign as a second. So, there are many roles that these support structures actually play. It's not just the name that they're called. A lot of physios go to all the events. A lot of them end up, helping with warm-ups and different things. So, and with the disability side, it's really important with the lower classes and if I can call it the more disabled, that they do have people that support them and help them, in order to if it is, get someone's leg from the side of the pool to the pool in order for them to be able to walk from, the side of the pool to behind. Often that is not just about the action of doing, but also mentally, that someone is there, that someone is helping, that I don't have to stress about that part of it. So support is absolutely, vital. It is the highest stage. It is very nerve-wracking, very exciting, and everything is just at an all-time high.
Yeah, everything is at an all-time high, you say. And then I wonder about, how things have changed during your time. We see a lot of Paralympians being able to travel abroad to prepare for the games. I know a couple of our Paralympians do have personal sponsors, as well. Some are on the OPEX program from SASCOC. How does that compare during your time, at the height of your career, when you retired back in 2012, and seeing the progression now with athletes getting their own personal sponsors? What are the differences?
I think it's beautiful to see that other athletes are getting their own personal sponsors, because back, when I was swimming, that was the only way that we really, I think, were able to travel and able to experience and grab those opportunities. Because in swimming, we're talking disabled now, but each section, able-bodied, open water, disabled, they all have different criteria. They all have different ways of actually qualifying, or, so it's not as simple as just the swimming team, let's put it that way. So, these personal sponsors, these, OPEX, they are all really, really big steps in terms of achieving your goal at the Olympic Games. And that is the pinnacle of all your sport. In terms of disability, we have different cultures from different countries. In South Africa here, I remember driving from Cape Town all the way to Knysna. It was Knysna, in order for an international classifier to classify me. So she took a tape measure and she measured my stump, and she said, okay, you're in class S9. Obviously, for different classes, there are different tests and different methods that one goes through in terms of classification. But, those were the methods that we had it was someone on holiday that classified me. Now there's a bit more control in terms of at specific competitions. Also in my day, the different the disabled was completely separate to able-bodied. So I couldn't swim at my national championships and get times.
Yeah.
I had to actually take part at the para national championships in order to be, for my times to be ratified, in order to send it to the international body. So, now we have the able-bodied is actually being ratified, so that those that are taking part in the disabled events can qualify at an event such as the able-bodied national championship. So it has become extremely more open, and I think a lot easier to manage. But with that also, I guess, comes challenges, right? Whenever you open something up, more challenges and slightly different challenges occur. But yes, it is wonderful to see. It is wonderful to see that, and it's actually the campaign that's running at the moment, is that para athletes are not just there to participate. They are there to compete. It's serious. It is, not about, the inspiration, but it is about getting out there and just achieving and doing what it is you want to do and want to achieve. So, the more that life becomes competitive, the more things have to shift. So it's great to see that more money is coming into the equation.
Yeah.
I think it's more about the opportunities to train with coaches, the opportunities to get equipment, such as a wheelchair, such as, if you're throwing the javelin, such as equipment that you need that is on the highest and the same standard as the rest of the world. Because nobody wants to compete at a lesser standard, and often we find ourselves there.
Yeah, Natalie, thank you so much for your time this morning on the Weekend Report, all those insights as well. It's now time for the athletes to go out there and, of course, represent their respective countries at the Paralympic Games, getting underway officially in 4 days' time from now, the 28th of August, and concluding on the 8th of September.